Hello, everyone. It is time to talk about psychological disorders. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's video. There's going to be a couple of parts. I think there's going to be 3 parts to the disorders videos. I know there's at least 2. I haven't made the third one yet. So make sure you watch all of them. I normally start with a joke, but I don't have a joke for psychological disorders. As you know, I have bipolar disorder, so disorders are not funny to me. They're really serious. Before I get into describing them, I want to just mention that if you ever have a disorder or someone you care about, there's lots you can do to treat them. You can see a psychologist and get therapy. You can see a psychiatrist and get medication. You can do all kinds of lifestyle changes like eating better and exercising and meditating. And you can get well if you have a psychological disorder. I have a serious one. I'm living a great life, though, so I know it can happen. Okay, what are psychological disorders? In this video, I'm going to introduce some concepts. I'm going to talk about dissociative identity disorder, which was also used to be called multiple personality disorder. And I'm going to touch on antisocial personality disorder. Okay, you ready? Here we go. All right, what is a psychological disorder? Psychologists define it as persistently harmful thoughts, feelings, and actions. And sometimes the definition will use the 3 Ds. It has to be deviant, disrespectful, and dysfunctional. Deviant means it's abnormal from the norms in your society, and every society has different norms, so it has to be compared to your society, your culture. Distressful, it means it has to be upsetting to some people, you or people around you. And finally, the last one is that it has to be dysfunctional, and this is super important. If you just have a quirky personality and you're a little different from everybody, but it doesn't harm you in any way, that's not a psychological disorder. It has to be a disorder, it has to harm you. So dysfunctional means it harms you, either your occupation, your social life, your physical health, something is harmed. Okay, who has psychological disorders? How prevalent are they? Here's a nice chart that tells you who has what disorders, what percentage of the population. So for instance, alcohol abuse, 5.2%. This is American population. This is the United States. Mood disorders that I have is 5.1%. Schizophrenia is just 1%. Any mental disorder is 15% of the population. So that's a lot of people that have psychological disorders. Now, you might notice all the numbers don't add up to 15. That's because some people have more than one disorder at a time. What about the United States compared to the world? We tend to have more psychological disorders than other countries. Here's a chart that shows you global norms. Maybe for a couple reasons. Maybe we're more of an individualistic society. Maybe we have a culture where people don't get help. Maybe we don't have good family relationships, tight-knit families. Or maybe we're just diagnosing people better. We're better at seeing problems and diagnosing them, and therefore it looks like we have more. But actually in these other countries, they have people that are suffering but are not being identified. So it's tough to say why. Okay, what about the history? Ancient treatments of psychological disorder included drilling in the head, which is called trepanation, exorcism, being caged like animals, being beaten, burned, castrated, mutilated. For a long time, it was thought that psychological disorders were some sort of demonic possession. Then a French guy came along, and he was a doctor, and he said, hey, we think it's a sickness. We think it's an ailment of the mind. And so he came up with what is known as the medical model. And this is the idea that whatever's going on mentally has a physical cause like other illnesses. So you see the medical model being used today by psychiatrists. they go to medical school and they treat psychological disorders, but they treat it mainly with medication. On the other hand, we have the biopsychosocial model, different from the medical model. And this is the idea that most modern practicing psychologists agree with, which is that biological, social, cultural, and psychological factors combine, and those things all together contribute to a psychological disorder. Now, in any individual, it might be more biological or more psychological, so it varies, but these things can all contribute. Okay, how do professional psychologists keep track of disorders? Well, they have a big book called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and that's where they keep track of all the disorders. It lists about 400, and the latest one is called the DSM-5. So that's the book that has everything classified. And the classification includes detailed descriptions. It's about a page or page and a half description of all the symptoms that go with each disorder. So there's a little bit of controversy about the DSM-5 and just labeling of disorders. And that is that labels can take on a life of their own. Like when I found out I had bipolar disorder, maybe I start thinking about myself in a different way, or maybe my friends and family members start treating me differently. So having the label can take on a life of its own. The big research about this that's famous was a guy named Rosenhan, the Rosenhan experiment. In that experiment, 8 individuals went to psychological hospitals in California, and they said that they were hearing voices. They got admitted, and then after that, they did nothing unusual. They just acted like themselves. They would ask to leave, but they couldn't get out. For an average, it took them 19 days to be released. While they were in the psychological hospitals, the doctors and nurses were observing them, like they observe everybody, and they were noting that the behaviors these individuals were doing, they were interpreting them as being symptoms of psychological disorders. For instance, one guy was journaling while he was in there, and the doctors were saying that he was like scribbling and taking mad notes, and this was a symptom, obsessively writing in his book. And so the label was taking on a life of its own. This person was acting totally normally, but people were looking at the behavior and interpreting it differently. So the other thing is that labels can create stigma. People can treat you differently if they think you're suffering from depression or if you have anxiety. So there's some hesitation to use labels. Nevertheless, labels are used because they're very helpful for psychologists and psychiatrists to be able to talk to each other and communicate. So your school counselor could talk to your psychologist, and you could have the same language and say, hey, this person is suffering from anxiety, and both people know what that means. Or this person has obsessive compulsive disorder, or this person has bulimia. And all the mental health workers, they know, everybody knows what that means. So the benefits of labels are pretty big too, even though they cause some problems. Okay, let's get into some actual disorders. This first disorder I want to mention is called dissociative identity disorder. It's a disorder in which a person exhibits 2 or more distinct and alternating personalities. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now, why does this happen? Usually, there's some really, really traumatic event that's so traumatic that it fractures the person's identity. And one way to think of it is this: conscious awareness becomes separated from previous memories, thoughts, and feelings. So the trauma is so significant, the person can't deal with it. Boom, their mind kind of fractures and they take on these different personalities. Having a sense of being, they could have a sense of being unreal, being separated from the body, or watching themselves as if they were watching a movie. There is a little criticism of this diagnosis. It was not really something that happened much before 1950. And then in the late 20th century, it starts happening more and more. And people don't really have it in other countries. So it's thought that maybe in America, there's some copycat, some mimicking going on. And maybe psychologists play a role, that they're kind of teasing that out and sort of subtly encouraging people to pretend that they have multiple personalities. So nobody knows for sure whether it's real or whether people are just kind of acting that way. But there's a lot of evidence that whatever it is, people have suffered from some serious trauma. Could be role playing, could be a learned response. Okay. Let's go to personality disorders. Sorry, I had a slide in there twice. So I had to skip through that. Okay, what is a personality disorder? A personality disorder is characterized by an inflexible and enduring behavior patterns that impair your social functioning. So one famous one is antisocial personality disorder. This is when a person has a lack of conscience for wrongdoing, even towards friends and family. Formerly, these people were called a sociopath or a psychopath. But these are people who would commit crimes and have no sense of wrongdoing, no regret. A lot of people who commit crimes feel guilty. They feel bad about it. But with antisocial, you have no regard for other people's feelings or for no sense of regret or guilt. It's usually men that have this. Okay, what's going on with antisocial? Is it due to parenting? Is it due to genetics? What is it? There's some research on the biological components of it. And one study on teenagers showed that people who had antisocial had lower levels of stress hormones before committing a crime. I don't know how they got this data. But it's showing a biological factor. They're not as stressed out at the prospect of committing a crime. Some other research on antisocial shows that there's different stuff going on in the brain. These are PET scans showing reduced activity in the frontal lobes of murderers. So the frontal lobes are where your judgment is taking place and your sense of right and wrong. So with antisocial, they're not sure exactly what causes it. It doesn't seem to be parenting. It seems more like it's something you're born with, but nobody knows for sure. There's always some nature and nurture. Okay, that's the end of today's presentation. Remember, this is part 1. I know there's a part 2 for disorders. There might be part 3, so check them all out. Have a good night.